technical difficulties. We want to know if there's anyone that needs Spanish interpretation. ¿Hay alguien que necesita interpretación en español? Está disponible aquí. I'm going to pass it to Khadidra.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the CUNY-Initiative on Immigration and Education Workshop Series. CUNY-I, as we call ourselves, is a New York State Education Department funded project that works to create opportunities for educational stakeholders to learn from immigrant students, families, and educators directly impacted by restrictive immigration policies and educational inequality. At CUNY-I, educators, researchers, families, and local leaders work together to learn about, from, and with immigrant communities, act in ways that center our shared humanity, regardless of legal status, and advocate for equitable policies and opportunities. Thank you for joining our workshop series to learn, act, and advocate together. So my name is Khadidra Martin, and I'm a research assistant for CUNY-I.
And I'm Andrea Juarez, and I'm also a research assistant for CUNY-I.
Okay, I just want to let everyone know that this event is being live streamed on Facebook and also on Instagram. CUNY-I believes deeply in community and justice, as we hope is illustrated in our grounding principles, which we'll link to in the chat. We want to hear all voices, so the chat is open. We hope that it will be an active place for conversation, resources, jokes, laughter, joy, and ideas. However, if there is any abusive, harmful, or demeaning language in the chat, we will remove that person or people. Abuse and violence of any kind will not be tolerated in this space. And as a note, we want to give credit to the Coalition for Educational Justice for this framing. So, without any further ado, we are going to get started. I want to welcome our fabulous panelists who we have and from different organizations, and they are going to jump right in and briefly introduce themselves and their organizations. And our order is going to be Edna, France, Sonia, and Karen, and Mitch, if he shows up.
Should we introduce ourselves?
Yes, you're going to you can give your name and, just briefly, 2 minutes about your organization.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Edna Sandoval. I'm a cross-border organizer at NISGUA, the Win Solidarity with the People of Guatemala. I'm also the political educator of La Unión Centroamericana de Estudiantes at UCLA. It's my great pleasure to be here right now in occupied land of Iximulé, also known as Guatemala.
Hi everyone, my name is Francois. I am the founder of Incultured Company. Incultured Company works on conflict resolution between Latinx and/or Afro-descendant people with a focus on people of Haitian and Dominican descent and the conflicts between that cross-border.
I'm next, right?
Yes, Sonia?
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, folks. My name is Sonia Sisodia. I'm the executive director of SAYA, South Asian Youth Action. We are a youth development organization located in Queens. We have a community center in Elmhurst, Queens, and then we also partner with public schools as well. And we work with around 1,500 young people every year.
Hi everyone, my name is Karen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the West Coast organizer with CISPES, which stands for the Committee on Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. We are a grassroots organization that has been around since 1980. Since then, we've been accompanying the Salvadoran social and popular movements and working on campaigns to limit US intervention in the region. Thank you so much for inviting us to be here today.
Thank you, Karen. So we did have one more panelist who was slated to join us, Mitchel Wu. So if he ends up making it, then we will certainly, he'll do his introduction and then we'll add him. But for right now, we're going to go to the question. So we did have a couple of questions that we prepared beforehand. So I will be answering the first couple of questions and then I'll hand it over to Andrea to ask questions. I just wanted to say that for those of us who are in the audience, please feel free to add questions in the chat. So as panelists are speaking, we will be taking notes, right, of your questions, and then we'll have some time at the end of our prescribed questions for Q&A from you, okay? So please feel free to add your questions throughout the chat.
Yes, I'll be monitoring. And Khadija, I have one announcement. So we will be doing interpretation for the folks whose organizations are also based out of the country. So CISPES and NISGUA, I know that we have folks on Facebook Live who were not able to tell us if they needed interpretation on the chat, but just in case they do, and there are folks that are listening from out of the country, Maristela will be interpreting after Edna and Karen in Spanish.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. So our first question is that we're posing to all of our panelists is, how do you define education? How does your work connect to the intersections of education and immigration? And anyone can start.
I'll go ahead and kick it off. I think that's a great question. We at In Culture Company define education as a continuous process of learning and unlearning, growing, and also challenging the way that you think that could take place both formally and informally. We consider re-education and education an important part of decolonizing, which is something that's central to the work that we do, because it's important to remove the colonial concepts of our identities and also our national narratives in order to be able to center the humanity of one another and also understand and empathize with our fellow man across borders.
At SIA, we look at education as holistically supporting young people grow. And, outside of sort of school education and college, preparation, we really focus on helping young people grow around like building their social emotional learning assets. And also we really focus on supporting young people figure out and become confident in their identity and the intersections of all their identities. So, as a South Asian centering organization, we do focus on centering all of our young people's experiences with their racial, cultural, and ethnic identity, but as well as the intersections of how gender, sexuality, immigration status, language, how all of those kind of come together. So we really do focus on helping our young people and supporting our young people through their own journeys with who they are and who they want to be.
I think education is very ad hoc to our context, right? Like, for example, we're here today on this panel that is an extension of this idea of education in the classroom. But I think we want to invite everybody to think about education on very specific terms, and also the education that we know as a continuation of colonial logics under the idea of epistemic violence, if we think ourselves as the racialized other. I don't know if I should give space for translation. I want to be mindful.
En cuanto a la educación, sí creemos que es algo que se debe considerar ad hoc según el contexto. Por ejemplo, tiene mucho que ver con la cuestión de la localización dentro del mismo salón de clase y de la manera específica en que se dan estas dinámicas, sobre todo en un contexto, por ejemplo, de expresión del colonialismo como un problema de violencia epistémica.
And I think tied to this idea of migration, it is extremely important to centering the knowledge that is being created in the diasporic resistance across the globe. and how that can be a form of solidarity with the knowledge that is being created in the communities in the Translatorial Solidarity. For example, we see a lot of effort in popular education to center the voices of the community that are putting their bodies in the front line. And I think we really need to think in the idea of decolonization of knowledge beyond the conception of what's on paper, but what's in the practice, right? And I think it is extremely important to be so critical of the institution and some of the ideas that we perpetuate when we idealize the ivory tower.
Sí, yo considero además que en cuanto a la cuestión del contexto de las migraciones, tenemos que centrarnos sobre todo desde el punto de la resistencia en la diáspora. Por ejemplo, está el ejemplo de las comunidades de solidaridad comunitaria, ¿no? Sobre todo en el contexto de solidaridad transterritorial, ver cómo muchas de estas comunidades centralizan sus cuerpos, utilizan sus cuerpos como parte de la decolonización del conocimiento, ¿no? Pasar de hacerlo solo en el papel a hacerlo en la práctica y siempre ser críticos de la institución, tratar de criticar esta idealización de la Torre de Marfil.
And to add to what everybody has been saying, we see education at CISPES as a way to develop people's like critical thinking and kind of like what Edna was saying, outside and inside of a classroom, right? Because I feel like education has so much potential because it's the space where a lot of societal ills are currently being reproduced, and therefore it's also the space where like social change can begin to happen. And so specific to CISPES, our objective has been to uplift the analysis of grassroots organizers in El Salvador with and share that analysis with the Salvadoran diaspora, with international allies, and more importantly, also to inform like the people living in the United States about the impact of US intervention in Central America. And I'll pause right there for interpretation.
Quiero agregar a lo que ya han dicho las demás personas, que lo importante, claro, es la educación para desarrollar no solo, claro, el pensamiento crítico, tanto dentro como fuera de la sala, el salón de clase, como lo decía Edna, sino también ver que el mismo salón de clase, que es un lugar donde se reproducen muchos de los males de la sociedad, es el lugar donde se pueden empezar a hacer cambios en la sociedad también. Desde el punto de vista de CISPES, para nosotros lo importante es el análisis de los grupos y los movimientos sociales locales de El Salvador, los movimientos de la diáspora, nuestros aliados internacionales y las mismas personas dentro de los Estados Unidos, enseñarles a apreciar el impacto que las políticas intervencionistas han tenido en los países centroamericanos.
And just to further add to the intersection of education and immigration, one thing that we've been working on recently is to show more information about like what is referred to as the real root causes of migration, which is a term that the Biden administration has adopted and has actually misused. You know, they have said like that, you know, poverty, climate change, lack of jobs are the root causes, and never do they mention the real root cause, right, which has been US intervention in Central America. And so we will be working on a real root causes of migration curriculum that we hope to launch in the fall, in order to be able to highlight the ways in which the United States has historically played a role in forcing people and creating the conditions for people to have to migrate from their home countries.
Sí, además quería agregar a la cuestión de la interseccionalidad entre la educación y la inmigración, que nuestro trabajo reciente tiene que atender las causas raíces de la migración, que es un término que se está usando ahora, está en boga. De hecho, la administración Biden lo ha mal utilizado, refiriéndose a las causas que han dado origen a los problemas que llevan a la migración, siempre centrándose en sí, la pobreza, el cambio climático, político, pero nunca aceptando que las políticas intervencionistas y las acciones intervencionistas son las causas reales, las causas raíces reales, y por lo tanto queremos diseñar un currículo centrado en causas raíces reales de los fenómenos migratorios para lanzarlo en este otoño con un enfoque histórico que analice el papel histórico que los Estados Unidos ha tenido en ocasionar los movimientos migratorios.
Thank you all. Like this was a really robust opening, right, to this conversation. So, just to kind of, because a lot was said, to summarize a little bit, is that, we're all kind of saying, I see a theme of that education, has to be critical. Education has to, be contextual, and we need to decolonize, right, and be critical of ideas, and that knowledge exists everywhere. Knowledge exists, and we're upholding our local communities, right, the knowledge of the people in our local communities. So that leads us on to our next question is, how do you foster, how does your organization foster conversations across borders, right? So what are the borders in your work, right? What strategies do you use to navigate around or to eradicate these borders?
Go.
No, you can start. You can go.
When SIA was founded 25 years ago, I wasn't part of the founding of the organization, but by my predecessors, it was intentionally, South Asian Youth Action, with the intention of creating a space that was not specific to a country of origin or religion for folks from the broader diaspora, and we've really intentionally worked to stick to that, as well as broadening even beyond that. Currently, SIA works with, as I mentioned, about 1,500 young people, and about half identify as part of the broader diaspora, but about 50% really reflect the communities and the neighborhoods that we're in with, folks from other backgrounds as well. And we are excited and welcome all of those young people into this space as well. And we think that that's beneficial for everyone, for all of our young people and our staff as well.
For CISPES, I think our objective is to create transnational conversations. So like I mentioned before, since our founding, we have been accompanying the Salvadoran social movements. And so we are constantly trying to uplift the perspective and the analysis of people on the ground. Especially because a lot of those voices tend to get censored, or more recently with the current president, either like ignored or repressed. And so we're constantly in communication with folks in El Salvador, and we try to foster these conversations like through webinars, workshops, and before the pandemic, we would have delegations that would go to El Salvador where we would get to meet directly with people on the ground. From different movements. We would also have speaking tours where we would bring folks from El Salvador to the United States, where they could go to different cities and also share about the work that they're doing. And so just to keep it brief, that's like the main thing that we tried to do, as well as to create these transnational conversations.
Sí, respecto a estos CISPES, ha tenido el objetivo de promover las conversaciones transnacionales, sobre todo, por ejemplo, con los movimientos sociales de El Salvador, a los cuales les hemos hecho un acompañamiento, hemos realizado análisis de sus actividades a nivel local, sobre todo para ayudar a estas voces, muchas de las cuales son censuradas o, por ejemplo, en el caso del presidente actual, ignoradas o reprimidas. Por lo tanto, nos mantenemos en contacto con las personas en El Salvador, en este momento a través de la realización de webinarios y de eventos virtuales. Y antes de la pandemia, incluso con delegaciones que mandábamos allá a reunirnos con las distintas organizaciones o a traer delegaciones de El Salvador a que vinieran aquí a tener estos diálogos.
I think that to kind of add some of those ideas, translatorial solidarity is extremely critical to create global solidarity at large. I think it is imperative to have conversations around abolitionism, thinking about institutions, but also imagine the border as a colonial institution itself, right? And we cannot have those conversations without, as I mentioned before, integrate the voices of the community to the center, but also to center the voices of the racialized groups that exist within the diaspora, right? At NISGUA, we have an amazing campaign that is being led by indigenous communities in the diaspora and in Guatemala. And I can paste the link in the chat. But this is an ongoing conversation because we cannot talk about migration, for example, without talking about settler colonialism, neocolonialism in some of the territories, without talking about forced displacement and neoliberalism, right? And I think it is so important to frame migration in the idea of we need to abolish so many institutions around it to have a true form of liberation. And I'm going to pause for translator.
Sí, quería agregar a lo que se ha dicho, que la solidaridad extraterritorial tiene mucho que ver con el abolicionismo y sobre todo el abolicionismo institucional, ¿no? Porque en parte podemos, por ejemplo, ver las fronteras como instituciones coloniales, ¿no? Y por lo tanto, la labor de integrar estas voces, de traerlas hacia el centro desde la periferia, incluye el traer desde la periferia estos grupos, por ejemplo, racializados que están llevando a cabo estas actividades. Por ejemplo, nosotros en Guatemala trabajamos con unas organizaciones de grupos indígenas muy interesantes que les puedo compartir en el chat el vínculo para que vean el trabajo que estamos haciendo. Para mí lo importante es que se vea que para poder analizar los fenómenos migratorios, los fenómenos de asentamientos y de neocolonialismo, hay que hacerlo viendo esto también como una necesidad de abolir un montón de instituciones y de impulsos para desplazarnos hacia la periferia, y eso es para mí lo importante.
I want to add also that when we think about migration and the way that peoples have been migrate, we need to think about the ontological erasure that racialized communities have been subject on history, right? So we need to have in consideration not only the struggle, but the resilience as well when we think about migration, especially when it's due to forced migration, right? To displacement. And I want to circle back to the idea of the transnational solidarity between diasporic solidarity and the communities doing the work on the land. Because I think we also need to be really critical about this idea of philanthropy or migration, or this rigid framework of human rights, right? Because we know that that's another institution that we need to be really, really critical. And it's often depicted on terms of helping the other, but still subject to the otherness, right? So we're gonna accept the other here. Instead we need to think about reparations. We need to think about giving the land back to those who belongs to. And the other thing that I'm gonna mention and that we've been doing at NISGUA is that we need to talk about migration on the voices of people who've been migrating, right, in their own terms. We're gonna have an amazing webinar led by young indigenous leaders in the diaspora, in which they're gonna be discussing migration in their own terms around abolicionismo, around the idea of reimagine the borders on the terms of going back to the land to those who belong. So I will insist that migration should be discussed by Black and Indigenous voices, not on institutions, because that's what we should follow. And I'm going to paste the link on the chat.
También quería agregar respecto a la cuestión de los fenómenos migratorios que hay que tratar el tema del cómo se borran ontológicamente estas comunidades raciales y cómo hay que apreciar su inmensa resiliencia, sobre todo en situaciones donde estas migraciones son forzadas, son desplazamientos forzados. Por lo tanto, la solidaridad de las diásporas es importante, tanto como la solidaridad local. En cuanto a esto, hay que ser muy crítico, por ejemplo, de la filantropía, de las rígidas instituciones de los derechos humanos, donde todavía esto se basa en la otredad, en, entre comillas, ayudar al otro, pero porque sigue siendo el otro, en vez de hablar de cuestiones como el pago de reparaciones, la devolución de tierras, el dar una voz a los migrantes que están migrando y que hablan de este fenómeno en, digamos, los términos equivocados. De hecho, vamos a hacer un webinario donde unos jóvenes líderes indígenas que se encuentran en estado de migración van a hablar de estos temas en los supuestamente términos equivocados: abolicionismo, reimaginar las fronteras, la necesidad de la devolución de tierras ancestrales, dar, mejor dicho, lo que hay que hacer es darle la voz a las negritudes y los movimientos indígenas en vez de a las instituciones.
Yeah, I would follow up on that and say that I think a lot of times the conversations around migration, as well as conversations around cross-border, focus in on the US as the central border that we're discussing. But for a lot of us who are Black and Brown, the US is not the only border that's been imposed on us. So in the Haitian and Dominican context, for example, a lot of Haitians will migrate to the Dominican Republic because it's the closest border to cross. That border in itself was established by the French and the Spaniards, and then Dominicans will take a boat and try to migrate to Puerto Rico, which it itself is still in a colonized state. And all of these three folks will eventually try to migrate to the US, sometimes through crossing through Central America, sometimes through dangerous boat journeys to Florida and other places. So we're existing in a context of several borders that have been imposed on us, but because of colonialism, because of imperialism, and because of oftentimes policies imposed by the US, the need to migrate is constant, but the conversations around migration specifically center mestizo or white passing Latinos and leave out the voices and the experiences of people who are Black and Brown, who are often a lot more vulnerable on these journeys and a lot more susceptible to victimization in every single one, a part of these journeys that I've mentioned. So in terms of like fostering conversations across borders, what we have done is really put Haitians and Dominicans in a space where they're able to come together in a neutral way and understand the colonial context of the ways that the island and our identities have been developed, and with a shared language and a shared understanding of history. The hope is then to provide an opportunity to move from a divided past and reimagine a shared future. I think one of the failures often that we've seen in other movements is that oftentimes we are not talking to one another. So even though a lot of us are experiencing some of the very same issues within our countries and our context, we are moving as individuals instead of a collective. So we're hoping to build a collective on the island grassroots to challenge systems of power and really take power back from the white people who are in power throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and give that power back to the majority. So we're using education in a way that we hope will disrupt the power structure and build cross-border solidarity, to build cross-border movements across all of the different borders that are constantly crossing us as we also try to cross them.
Thank you so much. This is really fantastic. And I want to take the time now just to introduce Mitchel Wu, who was our other panelist. So he's going to join us, and he's going to share his thoughts on this question.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Mitchel Wu. My pronouns are he and him. I apologize for the lateness. I was actually rushing to make this event while also just dropping off food for some of our impacted families in the community. Still kind of delivering food for food insecurity issues in the pandemic. But thank you again for having us and inviting me into this space. My name is Mitchel Wu. I work in the nonprofit sector in New York City, and I also teach Asian American Studies on the collegiate level in New York City and also in Northern California. And in response to the question regarding borders, I just want to say that, I appreciate the comments made by previous speakers about the concept of borderlands and the geopolitical context, and how it pretty much is the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And so, many times when people are working on, cross international solidarity movements, a lot of times it really is about breaking down the borders, right? With the concepts of borders, as many of it was forged, right, because of exploitation and a lot of this colonial mercantilistic type of relationships, right, with the colonizer. And so coming into, that understanding, right, what I would say is whenever there are these type of like cross dialogues or, cross-border type of convenings, we should always be very mindful within the context of where the different communities are coming from, knowing that many of us are facing different legacies of these type of exploitative type of histories. It's good for folks to really understand these type of different legacies and contexts, so there could be more mutual understanding, right? I appreciate also the notion earlier that was brought upon diaspora. And usually, that is also a good reference point, right? Because the diaspora folks can find commonalities, right? In terms of how they understand each other, and also then that can segue into the conversation of the context of how the diaspora has spread, right, throughout the different push-pull factors of migration, and where they're at. But for me, it's always coming to really understanding and respecting the context of where the different communities are coming from, which then can be a good starting point where people can have these type of meaningful conversations. And I would say even, that's the case even when we're talking about inter-community conversations even here, right? So even regardless of, we're talking about borders, so if we're having different cross-community dialogues even here within these borders, right? Having this understanding of the context of how, different communities have been impacted by larger systems of either marginalization or oppression. Again, those are good starting points of how people can have these more meaningful conversations. And I apologize, let me know if I am speaking too fast for the interpreter.
Thank you so much, Wu. Wu. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Mitchel. And just to clarify, we're doing the Spanish language interpretation for Edna and Karen solely. Okay. So we're pretty good. Would you like to add on any more to what you said, Mitch?
Oh no, I'm good. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So our next question, and we're still doing, pretty well on time, which is excellent. But I think our next question is, and whoever, if it's more relevant to you, you want to, jump in, you can, but it's on youth voice. So how do you integrate youth voice in decision-making and advocacy efforts, right? I know that this may, apply to some of your organizations more than others, and that's fine. But if at all, relevant, how do you integrate youth voice?
At SIA, it has been important for us during my time there to help inform our young people, but not from a one-directional kind of approach, like to help our young people become more critical consumers of the information that's out there, of how to, read and look for different perspectives, how to be critical of like different sources, but to really let them lead in what they want to advocate for and what they think is important, and not to sort of say like, okay, we're all going to this rally, or we're all gonna go protest. Not to say that we never do that, but it's really important. I felt that it's really important during my time there, during my 7 years at SIA, that really comes from the youth, and that's not imposed based on our staff members' perspectives, social viewpoints and politics. That it's really about empowering them to figure out what they believe in and give them the tools to do that, and not trying to mold them into what we want.
I think that I'm going to talk from the context of the work that we're doing, like at NISGUA, specifically in Central America, because in this case, it's like an intergenerational question, right? And I want to give like a very specific example with the Central American condition, because historically, there had been a massive wave of forced displacement and migration from Central America to the US in the context of the Civil War in the last 34 years. And I think that this is in the context of US imperialism and interventionism that was accompanied by heavy violence, repression, and in Guatemala, genocide. And having in consideration that this local repression and systemic violence was directed especially to indigenous communities and to indigenous femmes. So you have this massive forced displacement who was named as migration, and you have that migration way accompanied with a lot of trauma in that point. And I'm gonna pause here for the translator.
Sí, yo al respecto quería centrarme porque nuestro trabajo tiene mucho que ver con Centroamérica y esta es una pregunta de tipo intergeneracional. Para nosotros es importante analizar estas condiciones en el contexto centroamericano, sobre todo el desplazamiento forzado, los fenómenos migratorios que son consecuencia de las políticas imperialistas e intervencionistas de los Estados Unidos, que se han manifestado en violencia, represión, en el caso de Guatemala, genocidio, que han llevado al desplazamiento forzado y a los fenómenos que se han llamado migratorios, pero que realmente son el desplazamiento forzado de comunidades que han sido blanco específico de estas políticas, como las comunidades indígenas de Guatemala.
So thinking about that migration that happened a few decades ago, you have the migrants who are carrying a huge wound, and it's in Guatemala, we name them like the generation of silence, right? But then you have their childs who maybe were born here or they migrate here as very young individuals. And then we can see this intergenerational break in which so many stories that are untold because of trauma, because of many conditions, are passed to their kids, who is the youth who is leading the efforts in institutions, because they were able to access to different spaces, to, let's say, universities, to some other institutional spaces, or simply they are not carrying the same trauma, so they're able to communicate and speak what they need in order to seek justice and accountability. So I will name that it is so important to think about the youth voice in terms of intergenerational healing and intergenerational voices who are extremely political and have the opportunity to break that. And I think that in that case, the voices of the youth are extremely critical to move forward in the movement, because they still carrying all the beliefs and all the noble rage that it's within their families. And I think that's extremely important in the case of US advocacy and justice and accountability, right? And I'm gonna leave it there.
Sí, y en cuanto a la cuestión de la migración, me parece muy importante analizar las heridas, los traumas de décadas que se han heredado. Por lo menos en Guatemala tenemos lo que llamamos la generación del silencio, ¿no? Estas personas que pasaron por todos estos eventos traumáticos, y luego tenemos a sus hijos, y hay una ruptura generacional entre los hijos que han heredado, a los que se les ha pasado este trauma, pero que a la vez se han constituido muchos de ellos en líderes de la juventud, que tienen acceso a otros espacios, muchas veces espacios institucionales, instituciones educativas, que les permiten hablar en mejores términos o darles una voz para buscar justicia. También esto me lleva a pensar en que las voces de la juventud son muy importantes para la sanación intergeneracional, para que haya una sanación política por medio de estas voces, para que haya una manera de avanzar, basados ellos en sus creencias, en lo que han heredado, sobre todo en el contexto de la promoción de estas iniciativas en los Estados Unidos.
Hi, this is Mitch again. I would like just to add again, of course, we all know kind of the importance of the role of youth, having the youth voice at the table. But I just want to, in a way, also just echoes, for me, I'm a firm believer that for the youth to be at the table, I mean, whoever's also bringing the youth at the table, whether it's the organization, tours, there also should be a component which is just as critical, which is the youth empowerment piece, right? And so you want, many times a lot of folks feel like, okay, well, we just have the youth at the table, but sometimes it's just having kind of them there, and so sometimes there is the danger of just kind of just tokenizing youth, just in a way, just having them there, right? But you also want to make sure that they're there and they're meaningfully engaged, right? Which for me actually, requires that component of real youth empowerment. Whether it's if you have a strong youth organizing model to really, make sure the youth understand what it means on a community and a civics level, right? How they can make changes, kind of the structure of the whatever change they want to make, and then then the power that they have into making those changes, and what and what they bring in this larger collaborative. So I feel like the critical point there is also how you're meaningfully engaging them, right? And for me, those are all elements of youth empowerment that I feel like people have to be mindful about when you're engaging the youth to come in, right? So they could be real meaningful partners in this.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's already been said. I think the youth are such an important. I'm sorry, Mitch, did I interrupt you? Yeah, I was saying I think the youth are such an important part of understanding all of these issues, not only for the reasons that and Mitch named, both from in terms of empowerment, as well as hopefully breaking in generational trauma, but also the youth have the ability to reimagine a future that was potentially not possible to us or our ancestors. and empowering them with the information that they need to make the decisions that some of us were not able to make, and also challenge the systems and structures that have served to oppress us is really, really important. And it's something that we've thought of as key as well, because we've been able to see through our work that folks who have attended our workshops or engaged with us are very willing and able then to challenge power structures, whether it's standing up to their teachers who are teaching a version of history that is incorrect or oppressive, or standing up to even their parents when they're repeating things that are racist, sexist, homophobic, and things like that. And all of that is done through empowering them to be the voices of their generation and challenge structures that they inherently know are wrong, but solely need the language and the support to stand up against.
Thank you, everyone, for your insights on that question. I think that everything that we've talked about so far is incredibly powerful. And I have a set of 3 questions, actually, since we are going to be running out of time soon. I want to pose all 3 questions to everyone, and you can choose to answer part or any of the questions, okay? So I'm going to read them now. The first question is, what do you think educators need to know when working with immigrant communities? How can educators support transnational organizing work? That's one. The second one is, what do we need to know about transnational organizing? Why is transnational work important for immigrant serving organizations and immigrant communities? And what current events / issues are impacting your work with or on behalf of immigrant people most right now? And I think Khadidra just dropped them in the chat so that you can have access to them. So anyone can jump in.
Sure. I think I will take the question about what do people need to know about transnational organizing and why it's important. Let's take the US context, for example. I think one of the biggest failures of the immigration movement in the US is that it has fallen to respectability politics of painting certain immigrants as more worthy than other immigrants. And by certain immigrants, we're talking about mestizo or white passing immigrants that their parents came the wrong way, quote unquote, but then they were able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and go to college or serve their country and things like that. What that has done then is unintentionally said that other immigrants who are darker, who didn't cross the border and maybe have took a boat, or who came on a plane and their visa ran out, who may have had a run-in with the law, because if you're Black, you're more likely to have a run-in with the police because your neighborhoods are over-policed by design. Those immigrants are less worthy of immigration status. Those immigrants didn't have a dream, and they have been left out of the conversation, even though that we know that 40% of the immigrants in ICE detention are actually Haitian immigrants. Black immigrants are more likely to be deported and always have higher bails than white or mestizo immigrants. But the conversation around immigration, because it has privilege, proximity to whiteness, has left out those who are most vulnerable, whether they're Black, Indigenous, trans, so on and so forth. And so I think in understanding why transnational work is important is understanding how, when we fail to work together, we fail to work cross-borderly or transnationally, we leave the most vulnerable amongst us on the side, and we prioritize those of us who are already privileged, those of us who speak English, who are lighter, who are Western educated, so on and so forth. And I think that has been a very glaring failure in the way that immigration has been framed in a lot of these contexts and conversations. And it's something I hope that as we think about transnational work, we can push against, because there are people right now at the border who will not get the opportunity because they're from Cameroon, or they're a trans woman from Guatemala, or so on and so forth, because we have privileged only one narrative in immigration, and that's left out a huge portion of people who also need help and support.
Thank you for that analysis. Next person.
I would like to answer the first question. What do you think educators need to know when working with immigrant communities? Because I think that France brought such an important topic, right? Most of the educators that are visibilized and get tenure when they come from diasporic communities are mestizos or white passing scholars, especially thinking about Central America. And I think it is so important that we really ask to the educators who are in the front that center the voices of the communities, but the racialized communities that exist in the diaspora and in the country that they come from. And being in an institution like the university, we really need to think about the redistribution of funds as a form of reparation for the community. Meaning that if you have access to those funds, you need to find a way to bring that money back to the community, right? Because we're so used to this idea of cultural and epistemic extractivism. And especially mestizo scholars, and I myself, a mestiza, need to step back and realize when we're perpetuating Orientalist and colonialist ideas of presenting to the communities and put them on the front. And I think that we need to have uncomfortable conversations around the topic of working with immigrant communities. What communities are we representing? Who are we citing in the work that we are doing, right? Who we think that is creating the knowledge, because the knowledge is being created in the community, right? And who are we taking credit for? Specifically thinking on how historically white passing and mestizo scholars from different areas erase the work and the knowledge of racialized women, specifically Black and Indigenous femmes. And I think that we really need to walk around bureaucracy and do what we need to do to fund the communities and their voices. Like sometimes you have to do a marufia to the university, that's perfectly fine. Because we just need to redistribute that. And we really need to use the privilege that we have in academia to give back to the community. Otherwise, it's just gonna be a performative work. And I'm sorry, I forgot that there's somebody translating me. I apologize.
No problem. Sí, yo creo que respecto a este tema, para mí es importante responder la primera pregunta sobre cómo creemos que qué creemos que deben saber los educadores al trabajar con comunidades inmigrantes. Y me refiero específicamente, por ejemplo, a los educadores que tienen mayor visualización, por ejemplo, porque están investidos en una plaza académica y que la mayoría son o mestizos o pasan por blancos. Sobre todo en nuestro caso nos interesa a los que vienen de Centroamérica y cómo tienen la capacidad de ayudar a centralizar las voces racializadas de las comunidades, tanto de las diásporas como locales, y utilizar, por ejemplo, su posición institucional y las ventajas de las instituciones universitarias para ayudar a obtener fondos que ayuden a estas comunidades, porque tenemos este problema de un extractivismo epistémico cultural. O sea, estamos acostumbrados a tomar el conocimiento, ¿no? Y corremos el riesgo siempre de caer en estas visiones orientalistas e imperialistas del conocimiento. Tenemos que ver en el trabajo con las comunidades inmigrantes a quién estamos quitándole o tomando crédito de sus conocimientos, a quién estamos citando, a quién le damos crédito por crear conocimiento, porque el conocimiento se crea realmente en las comunidades. Muchas veces tomamos el crédito de mujeres indígenas, mujeres afrodescendientes, y yo creo que por eso es muy importante trabajar para tratar de saltarnos la burocracia universitaria si es necesario, para poder redistribuir estos beneficios y devolver a nuestras comunidades desde esta posición.
Just want to say yes to everything that you all are saying. I think all of that is super spot on. I wanted to answer the second question about why is transnational work important for immigrant serving organizations and immigrant communities, to, I guess, like highlight as well another aspect I think that I think sometimes gets ignored in like the immigrant rights movement, which I feel like sometimes there is a lack of an anti-imperialist lens in the immigrant rights movement, in the sense of I think it's important, transnational organizing is important as a way of having, like, I think a larger framework of what we're trying to achieve, right? And I think that in addition to providing direct aid to migrants living in the United States, I think it's also important to make sure that we're pushing beyond that, right? And that we have in mind that I think the ultimate goal is to dismantle US border imperialism, right? Which is what causes people to have to migrate in the first place. And also, once people migrate, having to face so many challenges in the journey that makes it just very dangerous, such as like border militarization. So I think transnational work is super important. It's like, I think, important to be able to be making those connections, so that way we don't get stuck in just like reforms, but that are moving beyond that and towards like non-reformist reforms that are getting us towards actually dismantling these borders, and also having respect for people's right to stay in their home countries, and also their right to migrate if they choose to do that. So I'll stop there.
Hi, I just want to share that for educators, when working with the immigrant community, I think one of the most important things is really about cultural sensitivity, right? And really understanding, and other folks has mentioned the different contexts before, and I mean, obviously, is also recognizing some of these, transnational legacies that probably has also, fragments of trauma that you have to acknowledge, but really just understand, really what the cultural contexts are, right? So this cultural sensitivity really then, will then manifest into cultural appropriate education, and it's really now how you can convey what you need to convey to, the immigrant community and the target audience that you want to get. Many times educators think when they're working with the immigrant community, it's all about, oh, let's just get them up to speed with language proficiency, right? Let's just make sure they can speak English and we'll have a command of the language and understand, the systems here so they can pass a standardized test, right? But it's really, and really to get through to these immigrant communities, I would say you really have to understand the different cultural contexts, and especially if, let's say, if you're educated working in a community and you're at this local enclave, right? Excuse me. You're at a local enclave, and let's just it's a small emerging immigrant community. There's a lot of different dynamics that impact them, that I feel like educators should have the onus, and the system overall should have, the understanding to know how to approach them, because so many times when I've been in classrooms, when educators are saying, well, how come these students or even their families, when we have meetings with families, don't make eye contact with us? So there's this different cultural context of expectations that they have for these immigrant families, which actually causes more barriers, but many of them do come from different experiences, and you really have to understand those contexts. Another example I will give is sometimes, there are folks, educators that work in classrooms where there's very, very low high school graduation rates, and just, and they want to like strengthen college readiness, right? And so they come in and they provide interpreters and translated material with, words that translated, such as, subsidized student loans and all these type of things. But even the parents themselves in their home country didn't even have exposure to that. So even in their own languages, they don't even understand what those concepts mean, right? And so when we're talking about cultural sensitive and cultural appropriate education, is really understanding where the community is coming from and then bridging those gaps, not just saying, well, I have an interpreter, they're saying these big terms, financial aid, financial literacy, and the parents themselves, even in their home languages, don't even understand those concepts. And so, really understanding that, for the community that you're really working with, and that ties into, like, some of the stuff that other folks just mentioned earlier, their, transnational, experiences, whether it's trauma, whether it's, many of them, bring those particular baggages, right, into the classrooms. You have to be very, I would say mindful, conscious, and aware of those things so you could properly address it.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm going to allow the interpreter to interpret for Karen's comments earlier.
I apologize, my Zoom froze and I couldn't unmute myself. Voy ahora a agregar a todo lo que dijeron anteriormente y que todo estoy completamente de acuerdo con lo que dijeron, es completamente aceptado. Quiero agregar mi respuesta a la pregunta número 2 sobre por qué necesitamos conocimiento acerca de la organización transnacional o por qué es importante el trabajo transnacional para las organizaciones que sirven a los inmigrantes y para las comunidades inmigrantes. Porque quería resaltar un aspecto que a veces se ignora y hay una especie de falta de un lente antiimperialista en este aspecto, como en el marco más general de este tema. Y es que yo pienso que aparte de la ayuda directa al migrante, hay que ir más allá de esto, hay que el objetivo tiene que ser desmantelar el imperialismo fronterizo de los Estados Unidos, que es el que lleva realmente a los fenómenos migratorios y que lleva además a condiciones muy peligrosas para los migrantes, como la militarización de las fronteras, etcétera. Y me parece que en este aspecto es muy importante que haya una conexión con, digamos, unas reformas no reformistas, ¿no? O sea, reformas que estén orientadas a desmantelar las fronteras y a encontrar una nueva manera de entender los derechos de los migrantes y los derechos de la gente a quedarse en su país de origen y los derechos de la gente a migrar de su país de origen si así lo desean.
Thank you. Sonia, did you want to answer one of the questions?
Sure, I'll just keep my remarks brief and just add a little bit to the first question from what my co-panelists already said. I think it's so important for educators to see as part of their roles that to affirm the students that they are teaching. It's not in addition to their core responsibilities, but I think it is part of, I think oftentimes things like, cultural competency or, phrases like concepts and phrases like that, I think sometimes in educational training spaces are kind of used like in addition to like your real job. And I think that we need to kind of change that lens is to this is an integral part of your role as particularly as a K through 12 educator, but even at the collegiate level as well. And, I strongly believe that, more of our K through 12 schools and colleges need to have teachers, faculty, administrators that look more like the folks on this panel and our, facilitators. So we really need, in order for us to truly have more lenses, taught to our students and more critical analysis, we need to have more folks of color, more folks with immigrant experiences, really being the ones making decisions at a university, at a college, as well as teaching and at the K through 12 level as well.
Thank you, Sonia. And thank you to the panelists. This was an incredible conversation. I'm reading some of the things that folks are saying in the chat. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a lot of time left for questions, but I think that there was so much thoroughness in the way that you answered the questions and then added more to that, that I think folks are still processing. And I wanted to leave the panelists some time if you have any announcements or any final words that you want to leave us with right now.
Well, just to thank all the co-panelists. Thank you. I've really enjoyed learning from you all today. And I did want to pitch that CISPES does have an active campaign. So if you would like to take action, I can put the link in the chat. But I did mention a little bit about Joe Biden, and currently there is a proposed plan for Central America to invest $4 billion in the region, which may sound on the surface like a good thing, but in reality, when you look at the history of the United States foreign policy towards the region, you see that those types of funds have only been destructive for local communities. And so CISPES has a campaign right now to cut economic development assistance towards El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, as well as police and military aid. So if you'd like to take action, I'll put the link in the chat. It'll just direct you to send an email or to call your representative. And I will also be linking a report that CISPES just put out around militarization as well in El Salvador. So thank you everybody for inviting us and for all your comments.
Quería dar las gracias a mis copanelistas y quiero compartirles en el chat acerca de lo que les comentaba anteriormente sobre el plan de Joe Biden para Centroamérica. Se está anunciando una inversión de $4,000 millones, lo cual parecería superficialmente algo fantástico, y sin embargo sabemos que históricamente las políticas de los Estados Unidos en este tipo de inversión han sido destructivas para las comunidades a nivel local. Por lo tanto, hay una campaña, estoy poniendo el link en el chat, para cortar asistencia de los Estados Unidos a El Salvador, Guatemala y Honduras, y a la inversión en gastos para la policía e instituciones militares en esos países. También les pido, aparte de participar en la campaña, que llamen a sus representantes en el Congreso, y he puesto el link para un reporte respecto a este tipo de fenómeno en El Salvador, y muchas gracias.
I would also like to mention that Culture Company has a campaign going on right now about Dominicans of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic who were made stateless back in 2013 and robbed of their citizenship. Over 250,000 people are still trying to get their citizenship back, get their documents, so they can do basic things like finish their education, own a home, and even go to work. So we're trying to raise money for their legal defense fund, and we'll also be filming a documentary about the current state of stateless people in the Dominican Republic. So I've shared a link if you want to participate in watching the documentary next week on the 24th, or donate funds to the legal defense fund so that we can help people pay the lawyer fees to get their documents in order to regain the citizenship in the country where they were born.
Okay, thank you all so much. I have to jump in here because we're at time. So what I want to do is I want to bring your attention to the chat where we have where I have shared the updated contact list for all of our organizations. Okay, so it's shared as a PDF. And then I also want to really quickly to share my screen for those who are watching the live stream. Oh, sorry. Okay, so here is also the here is the social media information and the websites of our 4 organizations who are represented. And then here's also the information from Mitchel Wu, New York City community organizer. So you can reach him via email at profmitchelwu@gmail.com. Again, this information is also shared in the PDF file in the chat. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia, who's going to give us some closing remarks from CUNY-I.
I'll move forward with the closing remarks. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, for joining us. for your flexibility and your patience as we got ourselves kind of situated at the very beginning. The only thing that I wanted to share was, just as Khadija shared the social media information for our fabulous panelists here, I also wanted to share our contact information, our social media information for folks to join and to connect with us. And so here you'll see we're located on several platforms, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please follow us for more information. And if you follow us on or if you go on our website, at the very bottom of the page, you're able to sign up for our newsletter to get updates on more of these types of conversations. And that was really it on my end. This is the last workshop of the workshop series that we've been having, of the speaker series that we've been having. And so a special thank you to Khadija, Andrea, and Lorena, who helped coordinate, organize this, and get us all situated, and to other folks who also helped us from the rest of our team, who helped to coordinate and facilitate all these conversations.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Follow up, we'll be sending out an email with all of the links. I've been copying them and putting them on an email for everyone.